Well, joining me here in the studio is Guney Yildiz. He's a fellow with the European Council on Foreign Relations and a specialist on Syria. Thanks very much for coming in. So I want to talk to you about the timing of this, because we recently had the summit between Russia, Iran and Turkey, and that meeting between Putin and Assad, and we've got UN talks due to start up. Is all the kind of activity we're seeing on the ground in Syria linked to that?
I believe it's linked to that, and it's these attacks also come a month after the ceasefire agreement signed by rebels and the government. And the government apparently used a recent attack by Ahrar al-Sham, one of the rebel groups in one of the towns in Eastern Ghouta, as a pretext to target this area. I think the main aim is to make rebels feel even weaker ahead of the UN talks next week on 28th of November.
So you mentioned there the Eastern Ghouta area, the suburb of Damascus. Why is this area so significant?
It is it doesn't occupy a large area on the map, but the population is between 300,000 to 400,000. It's a very significant rebel area right from the beginning, and it's very close to the capital city. The rebels have been holding this area against the regime in the last 7 years, and in the last 4 years they lived under mostly a siege. And the situation in this area was so dire that senior UN official described the situation as the region as the epicenter of suffering in Syria.
And what about some of these other areas? I mean, there's been quite a bit of talk about the fact that ISIL has managed to stage a few counter-offensives in some of the areas where people thought that they had taken control of them. What do you make of the ISIL element of all this?
The issue is actually ISIL is much less strong in Syria at the moment, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the Syrian army is in a good shape to take on ISIS. Despite the weakening of ISIS forces, the Syrian army has been suffering from war fatigue, and it has been very difficult for them to recapture areas from ISIS. That's why they're relying heavily on airstrikes and artilleries of different sorts, which increases the number of casualties, because they can't necessarily hold off against ISIS on the ground, fighting face to face.
What do you make about the Russian element of the strikes that we've seen? So quite severe strikes. What sort of can that tell us about the way the Russians are operating at the moment?
They've used some strategic fighter jets, like the long-range fighter jets, which flew for over 5 hours from Russia to bomb a small village. And I'm not necessarily sure about the military justification of using these kind of weapons, but we know that the Russian military officials say this is the easiest way to intensify the airstrikes in this region in Syria, because they don't have the capacities inside Syria. They also don't have the armed drone capabilities as sophisticated as the US has. So they rely heavily on these kind of weapons. And we also know that ISIS has manpads, like surface-to-air missiles. But the broader issue is that they want to, both Russians and the regime is trying to decrease the level of public support for both ISIS and the rebels ahead of the UN Geneva meetings. And the problem with Geneva talks is that on one side you have the Assad government, which holds most of the territory in Syria, and on the other hand you have rebel groups which hold very little territory, and the Syrian Democratic Forces, which control US-backed Syrian Democratic Forces, which control 1/4 of Syria, is not on the table. So that's the balance of forces in the negotiations that is problematic for this reason.
Guney Yildiz, thank you very much indeed for your analysis. Thank you.